And now I want to introduce Dr. Caicedo and take as little time as possible for this fascinating and incredibly gifted woman, a multifaceted Colombian artist, soprano and musicologist. She's a leading interpreter of Latin American and Iberian art song and is sung all over the world. As a musicologist, she's also an internationally recognized expert in the study and performance of Latin and Iberian art song. She is the founder and director of the Barcelona Festival of Song, a summer program and concert series focused on the study, history, and interpretation of Latin America and Iberian vocal repertoire. She lives in Barcelona and holds a Ph.D. in musicology from the Universidad Complutense de Madrid. I hope I got that close. And a medical doctor's degree, folks, from the Escuela Colombiana de Medicina. So welcome to New Jersey NATS. We've given her a huge topic with just 1 hour of time, but we hope that we might be able to expand that at a future date. But for today, an introduction to this wonderful repertoire. So Dr. Caicedo, we welcome you and I turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I'm very, very, very happy to see all these faces. I'm very grateful for these invitations because it's an opportunity to share my love and my passion for this repertoire. I consider people who know me, who are here, they know that I consider the promotion and preservation of this repertoire as my life mission. And for this reason, I have been doing for a long time, just not only singing, but researching and trying to spread the news about this beautiful repertoire. So I really treasure this opportunity to share this music and composers and poets. So we will start because this is almost an impossible challenge to do in 1 hour, to just talk about the Latin American and Iberian art song, which is a huge uh, geographical and cultural area. So we will talk today about the Latin American and Iberian art song repertoire, which is a huge repertoire, as I was mentioning. And I treasure this opportunity. And we have the face of picture of a friend of ours, Kathy, here, our friend Lori Sen, singer, who came to the Barcelona Festival, because she incarnates what I consider all the musicians and especially singers have, the 6C of musicians. I was thinking about that yesterday. What are the attributes of the musicians and singers? We are creative, we are curious, we need to communicate, we need to communicate, to contact people, to arrive, to bring, move people, to change the world, to improve the lives of people. So that's what we are here. And sometimes when we have all this curiosity and creativity, but what happens when we enter to the conservatoire is that we feel that we find a problem, that the audiences for the classical music are decreasing, and we have a difficulty to connect with audiences, and it creates frustration for all of us. This is connected with something that is happening at the universities. That is that the curricula of universities and conservatoires around the world is still anchored in 19th century curricula, values, and repertoires. So that question is something I would like you to have to ask yourself now. Why the curricula of universities and conservatories continue anchored in these Central European repertoires? So there is not because they are better or more beautiful or bigger, or no, it's because we are anchored in some values of the 18th century, when the Enlightenment was flourishing. And these ideas of the Enlightenment flourished in a moment in which the countries of Central Europe, what today is Central Europe, were the hegemonic countries imposing the aesthetic models. And within this mind frame of this Enlightenment, it was established a dialectic between the barbarism of the American, Asian, African, and all the other peoples who didn't belong to this center of powers. They represented tradition, and those centers represented civilization, modernity. So within this positive of thought was um, born this curriculum, a curriculum that is consolidating the values of the imperial civilizational project called the West. And this is why when we talk about the history of music, or in the universities or conservatories, they teach the history of music. They teach the history of music of the European music, but not the history of the musics of the world, because within the Enlightenment mentality, the only music that belonged to this civilized music was the music of Central Europe. And within this positive of thought, all the other things or cultural products were delegitimized and classified as of lower value. So this, the fact that the curriculum is as it is right now is not because the music is inherently better, the Central European music, is because it responds to certain values coming from a moment of colonization, imperialism coming from the central hegemonic Central European countries. So this is good to have in mind, because there are many other musics than the music that we learn. And this is the sort of frustration for the creative, curious, communicative singer or artist in us, who when we enter in the conservatory, we want to express, but we are limited, or in a way, I don't know if castrated is a word in English. Yes, by the repertoire that incarcerate us or limit us to a very specific, limited repertoire and ways of expressing, just the ways of expressing of the Central European music, which is beautiful music. I love it. I grew up singing that music, but it's not the only way. So what is this discussion has to be with music? What I'm starting with this, because I want us to be aware of the why the relationship we have with the repertoires, why we or socially we appreciate certain musics more than others, and also because I think this is a very good moment, a historical moment, to start defying those structures, because those structures were put in place in a moment where there were centers and peripheries. But nowadays there are no centers and peripheries anymore. We are in a multicentric world with a multi-vocal culture. So, and this happened to me now, coming to my own history. When I started studying I grew up in Colombia. I grew up singing. I started studying music when I was 5 years old at the conservatory. I grew up in a home where my father was hearing all the time Chopin and Beethoven and the great masters of the Western classical music. But when I started singing, I started singing folk Latin American music. When I entered into the conservatory, something happened, because suddenly that music, the folk music I grew up singing, disappeared. And I, for thanks to a teacher who, one in my first year of singing training, she gave me a song. She thought in a very intelligent way that it would be healthy for the singer to sing its her or his beginning in his own language, her own language. So she gave me, going out of the curriculum, because the curriculum said to her that she has to teach me the Italian antique arias in the first year. She gave me a song by Alberto Ginastera, an Argentinian composer. This song belonged to the Cinco Canciones Populares Argentinas, the 5 Argentinian popular songs. So when I started singing this music, I said, oh God, I found my true love, because this music put together was the perfect blend and encounter of my two loves, the folk music world and the classical music world. That it seems like this, in this music, there was the place of encounter of these two worlds. So I started a passion and for finding this music. It was like an obsession finding the sheet music. But the first thing I did, I went to the music store in Colombia to find sheet music or books of Latin American art songs. And my surprise was that they didn't have it. They had Schubert, they had Mozart, they had Arian Tique, all the canon, but they didn't have Latin American art songs. And they even suggest me that why are you looking for that music if you should be singing Schubert? So intrinsically, they were suggesting that that music is of Schubert is of better quality. You should be singing that and know that little songs, that the songs. So I started looking for songs, and the only ones that I found were the copies of the copies of the copies, because I discovered later on that there was a lack in the publications of these art songs, Latin American art songs. Some of them were published at the beginning of the 20th century and never republished. So there was first lack of appreciation that led to the no publications, of course, no performances, lack of recordings, lack of knowledge. So, and the music fall into oblivion. Of course, they were not included in the curriculum of universities and conservatories because they were, to start, not appreciated as good quality music. So at that moment, I identified what was happening with this music. So the music was hidden, but it didn't mean that it didn't exist, because after some years of research, my collection grew until having 2,500 around Latin American art songs. I'm not talking about folk songs or popular songs, art songs from 18 different countries, which means the music existed. So what we will do today, it is an impossible challenge in just 1 hour to just go deep country by country, but I would like you to have in mind at the end of this talk that there is a huge repertoire, and having an idea of in which context this repertoire was created. So when we are starting to think in repertoire from Latin America, so we have to start preparing our journey. And if we would be preparing a journey, we start looking into the map. Where are we going? So we are going to first stop is South America. So you see, it's a big area in which with many countries and many languages spoken. If you see here, there are almost 41 countries. Many of them speak Spanish, but some of them speak other languages, like indigenous languages. There are hundreds of indigenous languages spoken in Latin America. Hundreds is not an euphemism, is the reality. There are hundreds, some of them spoken by millions of people, like the Quechua language that is spoken nowadays by 6 million of people approximately. And of course there is the Brazilian Portuguese, spoken by is the sixth language in the world nowadays, spoken by 270 million people in the world. And the Spanish, that is a language that is spoken today by 590 million people in the world, and is the second most spoken language in the world. The United States has a big percentage of these speakers. So Latin America is extremely diverse. As all America is a melting pot of indigenous, European, and African influences. So now we know where are we going, but we also are going today to the Iberian Peninsula. And the Iberian Peninsula, you see the map in there, you see that nowadays it has two countries, which are Spain and Portugal. And there are, within this territory, there are several official languages like that are nowadays the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Catalan, the Basque, the Galician, and the Galician. So these are the languages we are now talking about. So imagine this is a huge wealth of art, song, and repertoire. So the packing list, if we are preparing ourselves for a journey, so we have to prepare our suitcases with, first of all, with two concepts. So the concept of art song and the concept of nationalism. Why? So let's start with the concept of art song that I'm sure you already know, but just to remind you that the lead or art song, when we are speaking about lead or art song, we are talking about songs that are combined poetry and music. And the lead genre was born in the mid 19th century in the German speaking countries, when those countries were looking for, those territories were looking for what they made them unique within the nationalistic movement. So the thing that made them unique, or they consider, was the language. So they look into the best poets to set that music, set those poets to music in short compositions for short and piano. So this became a aesthetic model, and that we will talk about it later on. We will go back about that. And now the other concept we need to pack is the concept of the musical nationalism, because in that same period of the 19th century, nationalism was flourishing. The countries were trying to, or the territories at that time, that were not the countries that are today, were looking for what they made them unique. And in music, what make us unique was connected to some regional folk elements that were included into the compositions. But it's interesting that if we see what in the definition of nationalism. Wait a second, that something is sounding in here. Sorry that I forgot to put and silence my iPad. I was not counting with the iPad. Okay, so let's go to nationalism. So nationalism, the musical nationalism served as a tool to create the national identity. So the national identity was what we were looking within the nationalism to build who we are. That was the question to answer at that moment, and how I can answer, and how art and music specifically serves to create that image of that who I am. That was the musical nationalism. But what is very interesting is that when we read, for example, in the Harvard Dictionary of Music, what is the definition of musical nationalism, they said that is the use of folk elements in the music created by the peripheric countries, which that's very interesting, because it assumes that there are central countries and they don't produce nationalistic music. The nationalistic music is the music created by the peripheries. This is a very interesting definition that should make us think for later discussion. These definitions have been changing through time until today, in which we can identify nationalistic music. It doesn't necessarily have folk elements on it. It could be a very subjective nationalism, and we will see that in the music. So, but in Latin America, what was happening at that moment in which 19th century, where the nationalism was flourishing? So at that moment, if we remember, most of the Latin American countries were colonies of Spain or Portugal. So within the a time frame of 1810 and 1830, those countries were achieve independence, and they start looking for who they are, building their national identity within 1810, 1830. Have that in mind. So at that moment, the countries who were previously colonies got into the hands of the descendants of the Spaniards or Portuguese. They have as a model of the good and the beautiful, as they would like to sound and be. Those European countries, Europe, because they were the sons, the elites who were in charge of those countries, were the sons and daughters of those Europeans. Of course, there were descendants of Africans and African slaves and also indigenous people, but they were not considered part of the nation. The ones who got in charge of these new countries were the descendants of the Europeans. And we can see that very clearly in music. And it's very interesting because the first symbol of identity is my national anthem. So the national anthems of those countries, or the national song as they were also called, were created at that moment as a way not to show what distinguished me, but to show that I'm part of the international, I'm part of the nations of the world. I'm one more of the important nations. So at that time, remember that opera was the thing on fashion. All over the world, the elites were hearing opera. They were to the opera representations as a way of showing that they were important. So let's hear some of the national anthems of Latin America, as for example, the national anthem of Mexico. So you see, this sounds like an opera. Well, it sounds like an opera, and most of the national anthems were composed. Latin American national anthems were composed by Europeans. Europeans who arrived to Latin America with opera companies and settled there, and they composed this music. So let's hear this one. So you must be thinking there that, yes, this is an opera, the intro of the opera is like a Bellini opera or something. And that's the national anthem of Uruguay. And all the national anthems, with the exception of the Brazilian one, were composed by Europeans in the style of opera. So the influence of the Italian opera was very important because that was the fashion at that time of the elites of the world. So Latin America was not an exception, or the United States, where America in general was not the exception. Then we have in Latin America the operas that were composed by composers, native composers, as early as the 1701 with La Púrpura de la Rosa, or this by Manuel de Sumaya, a Mexican composer, or the famous Il Guarani by Carlos Gomez. And Carlos Gomez was a Brazilian composer he was a mulatto, a very important Brazilian composer who developed a great, very important career at the Scala de Milan, and all his operas were debuted at the Scala at that time. He was a very successful opera composer in Europe. Melesio Morales, also a Mexican composer, debuted an opera in Milano. So let's hear the fragment of Il Guarani. Oh, let's hear if this is sounding or not. No. Oh, let's stop this. So at that time, you can figure that in this very early moment after the achieving the independence, so we are in this moment, I always think as a teenager, what is the question of the teenager? What is he or she trying to find out? Who I am. And I have some role models. I want to imitate them. So that was the question of at that moment. And the role models were Europe at that time. So they want to hear and look and sound the elites like the European music. And so at that time, Latin American composers were writing songs in German, in Italian, and in French. Most of the composers were trained, belonged to the elites, and they were trained in Europe. So they were the ones who could travel there to be trained, and they, let's hear this. So this song sounds like an opera aria also. But the interesting thing of this opera aria is that, or this song, is this is a Brazilian song that belongs to the Modinhas Imperiais, collected by Mario de Andrade. The interesting thing of this song is that at the time where composers, Latin American composers, were writing in the languages that deserve to be set to music, that were the languages of Europe. So this song is already in Portuguese, which is a big step in the recognizing the importance of their own language. So when the century, we arrive to the end of the century, and of course the rhythms, there is also, the most important is that in Europe, there is a trend at that moment, is composers like Bartók or Borjak, they are starting to look into their folk music and look into their own traditions and to create national sounds. So that trend that is happening in Europe is observed also by the composers of Latin America. And they were so disconnected because they belonged to the elites. This music belonged to the salons. It was parlor music happening in urban spaces of the elites where they have a piano at home. So they were disconnected with the rural musics, who most of the times were performed with guitars or with chord instruments that were of easy transport. So these composers start seeing that, okay, we have to do the same thing that Borjak, Bartók, or this trend that is happening. So we start looking into our own traditions, going out of the salons to start hearing what was happening outside. Also, not only outside of the salons, means also in other human groups. The music of it's a mestizo music. It's a music that is also happening between the descendants of indigenous, the mulattoes, the African descendants, etc. And at that moment are born certain rhythms that today are considered like landmarks of the countries, like the Vals and Joropo de Venezuela, or the Lundu and Gimoginha in Brazil, or the Bambuco y de Pasillo in Colombia, etc. So let's hear Also, we start idealizing the image of the indigenous. How should, how did they sound? We don't actually, we don't have any trace of how did they sound, because the colonizers who arrived, especially the priests who arrived, who did, they knew how to notate music. They, as part of the acculturation um, project, they never notated the songs. So all that we have of what the indigenous music should be is a recreation, is a construction. So romantic construction. So here in this song, let's hear this song is part of the canciones incaicas, the Inca songs. Are you hearing well? The musical examples? Good. So the composers, as I was mentioning, were to the tradition to started building or constructing what the tradition is, because the tradition is a construction. So that's why I'm said they look into real or imagined elements and started building the tradition. So let's hear this. So,
Patricia,
sí,
excuse me just one second. So I did get a comment that if you could turn them up a little bit, that would help. We could hear them, but maybe they're a little quiet for some people.
let me see if I can do something with the sound here. Apparently, is in the maximum possible. Oh God.
Okay, don't worry about it. We can hear it.
Let me see if I try here to do something with the sound. Volume. Yes, I found it. Okay.
Thank you.
So, what we were before starting with this, are you hearing now my voice? Um, so the composers started looking into the folk songs, and the folk songs many times were played with the guitar. So the versions for voice and piano many times are stylizations of those songs that are originally for voice and guitar. And also one thing that happened that was that the key was put higher in order to be to serve the technique of the European trained singer. So you start probably noticing that the songs start being in the original languages, and this thing started happening um, kind of late in a way, appreciating their own poets and own language. It was a big statement. And one of the composers who contributed greatly to this was the Brazilian composer Alberto Nepomuceno. Nepomuceno was trained in Italy, in Germany, and being in Germany, he met a woman, a pianist. They fall in love. She was a Norwegian pianist, and when he went to ask for her hand to meet the parents in Norway, She was a student of Greek. So they went to Greek's house, and this guy, Nepomuceno, observed that Greek have composed some art songs in Norwegian. So Nepomuceno, until that moment, had been writing art songs, being Brazilian, but he was writing art songs in German and in Italian. So he reflected and said, if this guy is Greek, this guy making songs in Norwegian, why shouldn't I also compose songs in Portuguese? So he, when he married the woman and they went back to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro, he went as the director of the National Conservatory. He started a crusade to sing in their own language and compose many, many songs. And he encountered a lot of opposition. There are a lot of newspaper articles in which the critics are saying that this shouldn't be done. But he set to music some of the greatest poets, Brazilian poets. Oh, let me see, go back there. I don't know what did I do. So this is part, I'm sorry, I have to cut all these examples that the music is what we want to hear, but since I'm short in time, I have to continue. So we just mentioned that they started setting to music the greatest poets, and yes, they did. So, and this setting to music their own poets also mean that the composers were kind of tuned with the poetic ideas of their contemporaries and people who live in their own land. As for example, Gabriela Mistral, who was a Nobel Prize Chilean poet, who spoke a lot about the poor people, the poor children in the streets, about motherhood, and many composers in all Latin America have set to music her poems. Also, some of the many composers also set to music Spanish poets, I mean from Spain poets, which also indicated a connection with the Spanish tradition and culture. And in each country, the composers look into their own poets and started setting those poets to music. But the real explosion of art for the art song, Latin American art song, came between 1910 and 1930. And if you see, remember I told you, please remember that between 1810 and 1830, we achieved the national independence. So that's the first centenary of the national independence. 100 years after, this song, the art song, starts to flourish, but also start to flourish because the elites start, who have the economic and political power, start feeling that for economical expansion, they need to include the previously marginalized communities. And including them means including their cultural elements. But in reality, is an abstract inclusion and concrete exclusion, because their cultural elements are included, but they on the concrete, in the real life, they continue to be marginalized in many aspects. So in this moment happens in different parts of Latin America, and I will just put my attention in different countries. Start happening something interesting, that is, for example, in Argentina, there is the Movimiento Renovación, and they look into their what they make us unique, and what figure holds all the values that we would like to have. And that figure was the gaucho. The gaucho is like the cowboy of the pampa. And this gaucho guy incarnated all the honesty. He was attached to the land. He held the traditions. So all the in also this was not only in music but in literature. There was a very important word called Martin Fierro, who idealized the figure of the gaucho. And at that moment, the songs start appearing many song cycles in the same fashion as the Siete Canciones Populares Españolas by Manuel de Falla. Remember? Manuel de Falla, as the Spanish composer, 7 Spanish songs. So this um, structure of this model of the 7 songs, that the 7 songs by Falla were 7 folk rhythms from different areas of Spain. This same model starts being replicated in different parts of Latin America. And for example, here we hear this is one of the 5 canciones populares argentinas de Carlos López Buchardo. So those are rhythms, and this is great because it's somebody praising the mate. The mate is this beverage that you see the Argentinians and Uruguayans and people from the south of the cone um, drinking, and it's the beverage of the gaucho. No sé qué tiene de rudo, no sé qué tiene de macho el mate amargo. Él lava los dolores del pecho en cada trago. Es el cura lo todo en la casa del gaucho. Alegra la alegría y destiñe la pena. El mate amargo. So you see that there is yeah, at that period appears that composer that was the one who opened the door for me for my curiosity for this, that is Alberto Ginastera. Writes his first compositions, his opus 1 and opus 2 were 2 songs in the folk kind, inspired by the folk rhythm. So we continue because we are short in time. And when Peru. What was happening in Peru? We are flying on top of these countries, and in Peru, at that moment, they look into the indigenous to give value to the contribution of the indigenous to the construction of the Peruvian identity. And at that moment, there was a composer who, it was a milestone in the history of the Latin American art song, because for the first time, the language of the indigenous community was brought and heard in the venues of the elites. That was very important from the symbolic point of view. So this composer, Teodoro Valcárcel, who was of indigenous descent, he wrote the 32 canciones del alma vernácula. It's called the songs of the vernacular soul or something. And these songs, you can hear, let's see if we can hear it. Let me try to do it in a higher volume, because probably here the volume is not the best one. How can we do it? Are you hearing this?
I can hear it pretty well, yeah.
Okay, oh, sorry. Let me go back to that. So if you hear there are some, those songs probably in other contexts were heard in the plazas, in the folk events, but here they were translated transported to the venues of the classical music. There are another songs, 10 minutes. Oh, we will not play this musical example. I'm sorry, but let me see if I can, because we are just arriving to Brazil. And what was happening in Brazil? The week of modern art. That was an amazing week in 1922, in February 1922, when led by this guy, Mario Giandraggi, who was an intellectual, Renaissance man, who was a writer, a composer, a poet, and who led the meetings, the first Congress for the Sung language in Brazil, where was organized for him. He put together all the musicians to the singers to define how the Brazilian Portuguese should be sung, and from that first Congress, some rules were appear to how you should sing the Brazilian Portuguese. This among many other things. So he led this week of modern art, inviting painters, writers, and musicians to try to construct the Brazilian identity in terms of art. And from there, in other day, when we talk about the Brazilian art song, we will talk about these two, Mojinha and Lundu, that are the main Brazilian art songs types. And as guest in that Semana de Arte Moderna was the young Heitor Villa-Lobos, that you know he's a very famous composer. He wrote many songs, including this one. This is one of that was the first one was a Mojinha, a romantic song, and this one is a Luntu, syncopated. So we could continue hearing and hearing songs, but we need to go to Cuba just put our attention in a few countries. And in Cuba, why? Because they represented a way of conceptualizing or approaching the nationalism, then in putting valor, giving value to the contribution of the indigenous or the mestizo or the Africans. So the Afro-Cubanism was a aesthetic and ideological movement that wanted to highlight the contributions of the African culture to the Cuban identity. So their slogan was "Abajo el lirismo, arriba el bongo." So the liris and the bongos were the instruments of the song, the son, S-O-N, this dance music. So, so this folk music was was taken as the paradigm of representation of the contribution of the African people. And it was a poet, the one who led this movement, and the poet name was Nicolas Guillen. And he wrote a collection of songs called Motivos de Son, talking about this rhythm. And he published those songs in a newspaper. And some composers, contemporary composers who read the newspaper said, oh, we could set to music these poems. But those poems were imitating the way the Africans spoke. They had specific ways of speaking that were considered bad way of speaking, but the poet was highlighting that no, this is a way you can speak in that way, and I make it into a poem, and these composers set it to music, were Amadeo Roldán and so I could continue putting examples, and I have to make, since we have very little time. One thing important about this Afro-Cubanism movement is that this movement is not just isolated. It's connected with the New Negro movement in the US, the Harlem Renaissance, and at the same time, it was happening in Europe. Picasso and other painters were highlighting the African mask and the contribution of the African art. So it was like a game of mirrors that was happening all around the world. So, and there is since 1940 until now, the art songs, the Latin American art songs, have all imaginable styles. So dodecaphonic, all the, because the composers affiliate themselves to the international trends or of avant-gardes. So there are all kinds of composers who wrote art songs and continue writing art songs in all styles. One of my favorite, I have to confess, and one of the composers that I love and I have to, is the composer Jaime León, that I consider one of the best composers of art songs of Latin America in the 20th century. So next year is his centenary, just for you to know. I I don't know, this is not sounding, but the good thing is that you, since we have little time, I invite you to follow me on Spotify, because in Spotify there is the artist who has the CDs, but it's also the user. And the user, Patricia, has a lot of playlists that are of very helpful for teachers or singers, because I have created the playlist of Colombian art song, Catalan art song, Argentinian art song, Peruvian art song, da, da, da. So in thinking that they could serve you as a resource for teaching or for studying. There are all kind of music too, because you will see I have an eclectic taste in music. But you can hear I recorded an entire CD only with the songs of Jaime Leon. And of course, I have to talk because we said Spanish, Catalan, Brazilian. So the Catalan art song, my adoptive land. I'm also Catalan. I live in Barcelona. I speak Catalan, and the Catalan art song is very rich, and also started being written at mid 19th century. Composers sat to music some of the greatest poets of the Catalan language, and these are just a few names of composers, of Catalan composers. Um, I also have playlists of Catalan art song in my Spotify, just for you to know, so you can hear a lot of examples. And perhaps one of the, if you see the names in there, some of you probably know when you think in Spanish art song, and this is, I take advantage of this opportunity to invite you to only use the term Spanish art song when we are talking about the songs composed by uh, composers born in Spain, and the rest is sung in Spanish. So some of the Spanish composers that we have come to our mind easily are Isaac Albeniz, probably, or Fernando Sor, or Enrique Granados, or Obradors, or Monsalvacha, or Pau Casals. They were Catalan composers. They were Catalan. They were Spanish but Catalan, and they also wrote a lot in Catalan language. So you must know Enrique Granados, Las Tonadillas de Enrique Granados. But if you hear this song, I don't know if you would think this is also Granados. That's Granados. Nobody would think that's Granados. That's Enrique Granados in Catalan language. He also has a big output of art songs in Catalan. And perhaps the most prolific Catalan art song composer was Enric Toldrà. I will not play this example because we don't have a time for it. But we have also the Spanish art song, the songs composed in the Spain, and the song, if you can go all the way to the Renaissance tradition, Renaissance songs, some of the most important composers of the time were of Spanish. That tradition also have influenced the composition of the art song, the modern 19th, 20th century art song. There is also the Sephardic songs tradition, the songs of the Jewish who inhabit the Iberian Peninsula and um, abandoned the peninsula, expelled in 1492. And also the flamenco music that also influences very much the the art song composition, and is harmonies and rhythms, and these all this richness is because in the Iberian Peninsula was the home of the Moorish and the or the Arabs who were inhabit and ruled the peninsula during 9th centuries, and they were living at the same time with the Jewish so and the Christians, and that melting pot, that rich cultural richness gave birth to all these musical expressions, including the flamenco, that is kind of a musical print of the um, Arabs in the peninsula. Some of the composers who come to our mind, the main ones of art song. So that was a challenge. I have been running, but my real challenge here is to create not only awareness, but to create the resources to facilitate to the singers this journey, because at the universities, for the reasons we mentioned at the beginning, this music is not part of the curriculum, and also there are no, so it's difficult to access the publications of the music sometimes. So my challenge have passed is to do research, to perform, to publish, to record, to teach, and to create all the spaces to facilitate for the singers to perform and to learn this. So I want the voice teachers to acquire the tools and develop the skills to learn the vocal literature and history. And to do that, I created the Barcelona Festival of Song. I created um, also for the diction of the languages. I have created books. I mean, I just created the Spanish diction for singers book and an online course, and also access to the sheet music that I created the Mundo Arts and the festival that is kind of the place to go and to be, I mean, deep into the just studying that is full immersion program, learning the songs in these three languages. And this happened for 16th year in 2020. So I invite you to go to the CDs that are there for free on Spotify, to follow me on YouTube, to go um, to the academia profile where I have a lot of articles. All those resources are for free, and you can finally, if you have not subscribed to this um, page I created for the class, I invite you to subscribe, because I will be sending a song, a sheet music, to all of the people who have subscribed to this page, just for having been in touch and continue this conversation that we started today.